All right, section 7.5, the downfall of Napoleon Bonaparte. I have a flashlight. No stories. It's pretty cold out here in the garage. I don't know if you see my breath. I can see it. Trust me, it's there. So, it just started for Napoleon, and now it's going to all fall apart. It's a very sad story, but we're going to look at Napoleon taking over everything, and then it just totally goes away. So, that's the story. Hey, so in class we looked at some images of Napoleon, and this is one of them, him riding a horse. So Napoleon the soldier, and if you look down there, you can't really see any of those other great conquerors, their names, but this is Napoleon the Conqueror, right? The confident, the conqueror. This is Napoleon the Emperor, regal, very fancy dressed, right? Worthy of a action figure, I would say. And then you have Napoleon, perhaps the deity or the god. So there's a progression, right? You've gone from soldier to emperor, and now you see him as a deity or god. And it's amazing kind of how this French Revolution has gone, how we started with a king and we're ending with a king, in essence, right? So it's just interesting how these stories happen. And kind of to start the section, it's really cold out here. To start the section here, Napoleon crowns himself emperor in 1804. So the first 5 years of his reign as consul, C-O-N-S-U-L, is basically rebuilding France, right? Rebuilding it after the revolution, after the Directory, does really nothing. And he does a whole lot of reforms, and we spent 7.4 looking at those. So in 1804, he crowns himself emperor. The tradition was that the Holy Roman Emperor, of the German states would be crowned by the Pope. And that was the tradition. So Napoleon, when wanting to declare himself emperor, invites the Pope to Paris, and legend says takes the crown from the Pope, who is this guy right here, and crowns himself. And then this painting is after that event, and it shows Napoleon crowning, or preparing to crown his wife, Josephine. And even though it shows her wearing a crown, she is about to add one too. So I love this painting. You just see all these people. Like, this person is so... Where's the angry person? I saw someone angry. Him, right? That guy is like mad about something. Here's a little kid, right? Here's Jesus. Here is all sorts of people, right? Here's Napoleon's mom. So this, again, is kind of the centerpiece of Napoleon's arrogance, lack of humility, I don't know what you want to call it. But anyway, as emperor, an emperor is going to have an empire, right? So we have really a constant state of war after 1804, in which Napoleon is seeking to basically conquer everything in Europe and to increase his empire. Remember, one thing that we mentioned in 7.4 is Napoleon loves the imagery of Julius Caesar and of the Roman Empire, and he wants to create a new Roman Empire, but of course with France in charge. So he got to go out and conquer people. Well, when he conquers them, this is a big point right here. One of the reasons why he wants to conquer them is, of course, his own glory, but he also wants to spread Napoleonic Enlightenment reforms across Europe. So the reforms that we discussed in 7.4 will be applied to places that he conquers. So you could think like, well, that's kind of a good thing for the people there, especially if they have an absolute monarch and things have not been good. But he also, basically to make sure that those places enforce his reforms, he's going to strip power from the monarchs in the places he conquers, and he's going to put his family in charge there. So his family members will be on thrones all across Europe, like his brothers in Spain. He's got a brother in Westphalia, which is a German state where Treaty Westphalia was. He's got a brother in the Netherlands. So you've got basically Bonapartes everywhere across Europe, trying to enforce those Enlightenment reforms in the places that Napoleon conquers. Now, Austria and Prussia were defeated by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz, but he did not replace the kings or queens there and the monarchs there. He basically had them in his pocket, though, in case they tried to behave in a poor way. So Napoleon basically is beating everyone up except for England. And England uses their geographic advantage of being apart from everyone else across the water to their advantage. Napoleon cannot defeat the English navy, and it basically settles into a pattern after the Battle of Trafalgar of accepting that England is going to be outside of his control in terms of his ability to invade them, right? So you have the Battle of Trafalgar, and at this point, only really the British are resisting Napoleon. So the question is, what can Napoleon do about Britain? Well, we'll get to that in a second. What he does do, though, first of all, is he tries to reorganize Germany. Remember the German states. There were 300 of them. So in order to better control them after he conquers these areas, he reorganizes Germany into what's called the Confederation of the Rhine. The Rhine is a river that runs through western Germany. And he changes it from 300 to 15 states, easier to manage, right? He excludes Austria and Prussia from this. So Austria and Prussia, the two dominant German states, are all doing their own thing. But what Napoleon does is he takes all the rest of them and makes them 15 separate states. Now, the question is, what effect does that have? For Napoleon, he'd care less, right? He's Napoleon. He can beat your butt at any point. But what it does is inside of the German states, these states are different politically, but culturally, ethnically, language, religion, they're very similar. What he does is he creates a common enemy inside of these states. So even though you take 300 and you put them into like 15 different ones, you're going to get little arguments, right, between people who used to be able to do just their own thing, and now they have to share power or whatnot, or share whatever resources. But you have also created a common enemy. So if these German states say, you know what, I said that like 4 times. These German states say, if we existed as 300 and we've shrunk it to 15 and we haven't killed one another, then why don't we shrink it more? Because the bigger we are, the better we are, the stronger we can be. And thus a sense of German nationalism grows. Pride in your ethnic group, pride in your nationality. It's a term that we're going to see the whole second semester, and inside of the German states, Napoleon inadvertently instigates and triggers a growth of German nationalism. So more on that story down the road. Okay, so Napoleon's great. It all falls apart. Question is why? This is one of the more famous structures in Paris. It's called the Arc de Triomphe. It was built and constructed by Napoleon, I believe. It's constructed by Napoleon as a way to honor the military victories that France achieved under his reign. And if you ever get to go visit there, it's a huge structure. I mean, it's probably about, you can see these little cars, right? Little PT Cruiser right there. You walk inside of the structure. The names of all of Napoleon's battles are written and inscribed on the walls of the Arc de Triomphe. The Arc de Triomphe, triumph, right? It's the French word for triumph. So it's a very cool spot, and it represents Napoleon's great victories in battles, but we must now turn our attention to the sadness that is his defeat. It all starts with England. Remember, Napoleon could not invade England. So is there a way for him to get at them without going to them? Well, Napoleon decides to create what's called the Continental System. And the Continental System was France basically blockading with their navy the whole continent from British trade. So the British, in Napoleon's eyes, would not be able to trade with the rest of Europe. Now, here's the thing about Britain and trade. We've entered the 19th century, in the 1800s. We're going to see in Unit 8 that the British make good stuff. They can make good products. It's this little thing called the Industrial Revolution that's happened, and it's helping England or Britain become an economic powerhouse. So you're going to possibly, by doing this, France, not only tick off England because it might hurt them economically, but you might tick off the places that you've conquered because they want British goods, right? Again, Napoleon, he doesn't care. It's all about Napoleon. The goal is to isolate Britain and to defeat them in an economic battle, right? That they're struggling, that they're hurting for trade, and it's going to be a bad thing. Now, you're like, well, England, why don't they just trade with somebody else? Well, really, the only somebody else who's viable in the world at this point is the United States. And the U.S. is not in a very giving mood with England, as we're only 30 years removed from the American Revolution, only 20 years removed from basically the installation of the United States. So for England, it's kind of a problem, but as we're going to see here, it's not going to be the end of the world, because not all areas in Europe are going to accept the system. Primarily, Portugal. The Portuguese decide, even though Napoleon has gone and basically conquered all this area, and you can see France has increased its size significantly, the Portuguese and Poland should not be there. This map is wrong. Poland should not be on that map. But the Portuguese, well, actually, it might, at this point, it might be. Whatever. That's not the point. The Portuguese say, no, we're going to keep accepting British goods. So Napoleon, he can't let that stand, right? So he's going to start marching troops from France down into Portugal to try to force the Portuguese to accept the system, right? Well, to get from France to Portugal, you've got to march troops. You want to march troops, you got to march them through Spain. Well, the Spanish don't really like that, right? You look outside and you get the French troops just marching by. You don't like that. And this triggers what becomes known as the Peninsular War. It is a war in which the Spanish fight in guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla. That's it. Guerrilla warfare. And let me see if I can write it for you. G-U-E-R. That's spelled right. That might have one too many R's. It's called guerrilla warfare. And what it is basically, if the Spanish are not going to line up on the battlefield and beat the French, like lining up the traditional way. It's when the French march through an area, the Spanish are going to pick and pop, right? They're going to come out from behind the hill or behind the barn or whatever it is and hit them with short attacks and then like flee, right? Because you can't match them number versus number. And this battle, this war goes on for about 10 years. It's something that the French get bogged down in, and it's incredibly frustrating for Napoleon. But it's also incredibly frustrating for the rest of Europe because they see the Spanish rising up against Napoleon. And they're like, well, you know what? Why are we letting these Bonapartes kind of run our show? So you're starting to get across Europe these inklings of rebellion against the system that Napoleon has put into place. Now, one country that had volunteered to accept the system, but now starts to question it itself, way over in the east, Russia. The Russians are saying, you know what? The Portuguese are doing this. We didn't even fight Napoleon. We said, we'll accept your system because we don't, who cares? We're not really wanting to poke the bear, so to speak. But the Russians decide, you know what? We're going to throw that system off too. We want to trade with the British. This ticks Napoleon off because he's like, I can't let the Portuguese do this. And now the Russians are talking about this too. Okay, well, I'm coming for you, Russia. And Napoleon takes about 1 million troops and they march. And again, it's not a short walk. It is all the way over to Russia. So where Paris is, which is about right here, then it's all the way over. All right. So Napoleon invades Russia with an army of 600,000. So not 1 million, but 600,000 men. Napoleon goes. Right? He's not sitting in Paris and watching. He goes. Well, when they invade, the French invade, the Russians use a policy called scorched earth. What that is as let's see. You got the French here and you got the Russians here. Okay? So as the Russians retreat back into Russia, and the French chase them, what happens is that when the Russians get to each community, they will burn everything in that community. And these are Russian villages. They will burn everything in that community and destroy everything in that community and village that the French could pick up as they come through. Because remember, as the Russians retreat, right, and as the French follow them in, Paris is all the way back here. So it takes longer to supply the French army as they go farther east. And they're running out of supplies because the Russians won't let them pick anything up, whether it be cows, grain, whatever it is. And you can't exactly stop at Walmart on your way into Western Russia in 1812. So that's kind of the deal, is that as the French go farther in, they get farther away from their supplies. And guess what happens? Just like in here, in this garage, it gets cold. And it gets so cold that once they reach Moscow, the capital city, that the Russians have basically worn out this French army. And the army cannot knock the basically knockout blow to the Russian army, because again, the Russian army is withdrawing farther and farther into the country. So the French basically have to turn around and head back home because there's no one to fight. And as they come back home, guess what the Russian army does? They're going to chase you back. Okay? And only 30,000 of the 600,000 return home. When the French army with Napoleon, when they return back to Paris, only 30,000 of them left. Many, many of those troops dying, not in bloody battle, but from the elements, from exposure, from starvation. And in fact, they're still in Poland today and in Belarus and these countries, Ukraine, they're still digging up remains from French troops from this campaign. It's an incredibly sad story for the French army and for humanity in general. So when the French return home weakened, the enemies of France and of Napoleon find that this is the perfect time to pounce on a weaker France. And pounce is what they do. And this gives you kind of some visuals about that Russian campaign. The weather is awful. The elements are awful. And death is basically all around for this French army. And for Napoleon, when he returns to Paris, he finds that now Austria, Prussia, Russia, England, the Netherlands, all of these stronger countries in Europe are rising up to try to stop this man and end his power and smooth out the balance of power in Europe. And Napoleon, as he restores his army, as he builds it back up, his French troops are defeated soundly at the Battle of Leipzig, which is in Germany, or Leipzig, perhaps. And he's defeated by these major European powers, and it seems his army and his reign is coming to an end. They come to him with a deal, the leaders of these countries, and they say, okay, Napoleon, you're going to have to give up all this land that you conquered, and we're going to let you continue to rule. He wouldn't do it. Napoleon would not surrender. He would not give up. So the powers will exile Napoleon to the small island of Elba. They will send him to this island here of Elba, right here, which is just off the coast of Italy. And they give Napoleon a garrison of troops at Elba and say, hey, you can, you wouldn't give up your empire, so you can have Elba and you can have these troops here. And you can just imagine all the Prussian king and the English prime minister, how much of a joke that I'm sure they felt. And they left Napoleon basically on this island, and they're like, go away. So the question is, what happens after Napoleon's gone to France, because he's on this island never to return. So in France, it's like, what do we do now? Well, the French people are tired, right? They're tired of war. They're tired of upheaval. So you know what? It would only make sense. 1789. This is just kind of silly. The Bourbons. Louis XVI had a younger brother named Louis. Well, I don't know what his name was. But he is asked to serve as a constitutional monarch. Louis XVIII. The 17th was 16's son who died in prison. But this will be Louis XVIII. And imagine that we have done all of this unit, and we're back to basically where we started. Granted, it's a constitutional monarchy, some limits on the king's power, but the Bourbons are back in town. Can you believe it? Here we are, and that is the end of the story. Or is it? Because somebody forgot to tell the security on Elba to watch the loose ships, because Napoleon somehow commandeers a boat and returns to France. And he sails, remember, the Elba's not that far away, gets on the belt, and then sails up and lands in the south of France. And when he gets there, he meets troops that have been sent because the word is out that Napoleon has escaped. And he meets these troops who meet him to try to arrest him, but Napoleon gives this speech and convinces them that he can make France great again, and try to rebuild his army so they can restore the empire. And these troops are like, yeah, let's do it. So he gathers support, and Napoleon invades Paris. And when he gets there, it gets even crazier because Louis XVIII is like, wah! And he runs out of town, and Napoleon is back in charge, and the empire is back, and everything's great, and the leaders of the other European countries are like, what is going on? And Napoleon is back in town, and then we have a last battle. And at that battle, the European powers again restore their armies, and Napoleon has restored the French army, and they fight at a Belgian community called Waterloo. And it was here that Napoleon is back for round 2, but like at Leipzig, Napoleon is defeated by primarily an English nobleman named the Duke of Wellington, named Arthur Wellesley, not Arthur Weasley, but Arthur Wellesley. And this ends the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. For a second time, they ask, what are we going to do with him? How do we deal with this guy now? Because the first time we exiled him to an island, that didn't really work for us. So what do? We're going to exile him to another island. Although this one is a little bit farther away in the South Atlantic. Okay, it's called St. Helena, and Napoleon is sent there in 1815. And basically sent there to live out his final days. There he is. Very romantic picture. This is actually the place on St. Helena, the island, the estate that Napoleon stayed at. And when I'm telling you he's banished to an island, he's not left there alone. This is a French island. Not a colony, perhaps, but just a possession that they have. And basically, this is where Napoleon lived out the rest of his days. He lived there for 6 years. Most people believe that he died of stomach cancer in the year 1821. But, I mean, you can imagine kind of how painful this was. This is a guy who conquered most of Europe. He went down fighting, and he sees the last bit of his life on an island half a world away. In 1821, he passes away. He would be returned to Paris. There would be a funeral for him, a state funeral, and you can visit his tomb in Paris today and still visit that. So, like, what does this mean? Like, if we had to evaluate Napoleon's role, this is just kind of a short little thought bubble here, is how do we look at this guy? So first, egalitarian dictatorship. Well, egalitarian basically means that you're seeking to promote human rights, but at the end of the day, it was a dictatorship. I mean, he was basically in charge, and nobody else could really talk to him otherwise. There are lots of positives, okay? Centralize the French government with the Unified Law Code, the Napoleonic Code, enforcing equality before the law. I mean, these are good things. Lasting settlement with the church, the Concordat of 1801, returned the church to French society to where it still is, right? The Roman Catholic Church still has a public presence, although not as strong as potentially it was in the past. And listen, he spreads his positive achievements of the French Revolution through Europe. All of these things, the equality, liberty, fraternity, they are all spread. The expectation that countries should progress to this new society, this Enlightenment-based society, which was a little bit calmer than Robespierre's Republic. This is something that was spread, so perhaps these are positives. But we also consider the negatives. Repressing individual liberties, and we've seen examples of that. Freedom of the press, with the police state, with spies and whatnot. And certainly oppressed common or conquered people throughout Europe. He doesn't give those people the chance to choose kind of what they want to do with their government. He's installing his people, his family in charge. So these are all things that are potentially negatives. And then, of course, you have the restriction of women's rights as well. I'm not sure if I have that on here. And, of course, he brings war to the continent. I mean, for 10 years, 1805 to 1815, Europe is fighting. And some of the biggest battles, Waterloo, Leipzig, are some of the biggest battles of human history up to this point. The Russian campaign was a disaster. Brought a lot of death and destruction to Eastern Europe. So he's a complicated figure, and I think that's something that we have to consider through history, is that nobody is simple. No one is easy to put in a box. Everyone has positives and negatives, some more than others, but certainly Napoleon is one of those figures. So with that, that ends the first half of European history. Napoleon is always halftime. So the question for the start of the second half will be, what does Europe do next? Socially, politically, culturally, intellectually, economically, even like what, and in a religious sense, where does Europe go next? With Napoleon gone, with the Enlightenment still floating around and inspiring people to rebel for more government and political rights, the question is, where do we go next? And we're going to stop with the politics a little bit with Unit 8 and talk about perhaps the most influential unit of our course with the Industrial Revolution. So that's where we're headed next, but that will happen next. My feet are frozen out here in this garage, and I can't wait to record some of these in the winter when I will continue to freeze. So yay, that's fun. We'll see you later.